Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. One of the key roles of journalism is to describe the world that we live in, is to produce stories that explain why we're seeing what we're seeing. Stories that might actually matter to your life. And what are the things that do matter to your life? Well, they're the things all around you, right? Crime matters to your life. Energy matters to your life, since it's the basis of all civilization. So if you're not writing incisive stories about crime and energy, not theoretical stories, but stories that describe the reality we're watching, then you're not really practicing journalism. Well, by that measure, one of the most effective journalists of our time is not strictly speaking a journalist. He's an author, and he's a keen observer, and he's a truth teller. His name is Michael Shellenberger. He's a frequent guest on our nighttime show. And one of the things he's been writing about is the city he lives near, which is San Francisco, one of the prettiest cities, probably the prettiest city in the United States, which has completely collapsed. Why is that? No one seems interested. He is. He's written a lot about it. He's also run for governor of California to save the state that he lives in. He's the author of the book San Francisco. Michael Shellenberger joins us now. Michael Shellenberger, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
You're not strictly speaking a journalist, correct?
I do. At this point, I consider.
Yeah, well, you function as one.
That's how I make my money.
Right.
So,
So it's just so interesting. You're one of those people who came to at least my attention. I'm a little old and out of it, but by your writing on energy, which was really incisive. Here's where it comes from. Here's its effect. Here's what it cost. You know, it's kind of the basics in a really, really smart way. And then you trained your powers of common sense and reasoning and observation on the crime problem, which is very heavily a problem of vagrancy and drug addiction, and explained that in a way that no one else has bothered to. And then you wrote this amazing book about the collapse of San Francisco. So I really wanted to meet you and find out who you are and where you're from and how'd you end up doing this, and then what you've discovered. So can we just start at the beginning by asking, where are you from and how'd you get to do this?
Sure. Well, so I'm from a small town in Colorado called Greeley, Colorado. Yep. It's the second largest meatpacking facility in the world.
Named after Horace Greeley, I think.
Yep, that's right. And let's see, my parents were very progressive, and I was a very radical left-wing youth. I went to Nicaragua when I was 17 to help the Sandinistas.
No way.
That's where I learned Spanish, and then I went to Brazil and learned Portuguese while helping and doing anthropology with peasants basically in the semi-Amazon fighting against big landlords. I was very in love with the progressive left-wing movements of Latin America, and that's really where I spent my 20s.
Was that inspired by the culture you grew up in, by religious faith? Like, how did you get to be a progressive in the first place?
Yeah, I was raised Christian, but I wasn't Christian until very recently. And I guess I would say that I
was raised Christian, but I wasn't Christian. That is a line
confirmed Christian.
Heard before, yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm really interested right now is the ways in which I think that rising secularism in the culture is creating a kind of religious fanaticism on the radical left.
Yes.
And for me, it's whenever I'm trying to understand it, I just try to remember my own past. I try to look back at how I was, and I think that for me, revolutionary socialist movements were a kind of religious, kind of a way to imagine oneself having a transcendent moral purpose.
Yes.
And so it was then seeing what was really going on the ground, and the ways in which these movements were very disappointing, the ways in which left-wing governments were very corrupt, very violent, and ended up kind of losing my innocence in Latin America and seeing how things were really going, that I then started to reconsider some of my views.
So I want to ask you to be more precise about the experiences that changed your views, but I couldn't help but notice in your bio that you went to Earlham College.
Yes.
Which I think may be the most left-wing college in the world. Maybe?
Could be. Could very well be.
What was that like?
Well, it's funny because there's this idea that there's a conspiracy theory that there's sort of training for people to go into institutions as progressives and change them from the inside out. But that's the training I received. The idea was you would go occupy, major institutions in the society and basically radicalize them from within. This is sometimes known as the long march through institutions. That was basically what we were trained in. It comes out of a Marxist tradition, started with an Italian Marxist named Antonio Gramsci.
Yes.
And then some of the ideas were picked up by the French historian and anthropologist Michel Foucault. So that was what we were trained to do. It was kind of considered cultural work, activist work. And so really I was a young activist trained to transform society by occupying the institutions from within.
It's you have to stand back and admire the strategy for its effectiveness, I must say.
Yeah, and I think the discipline that it requires
Yes.
and the patience
That's
that
right.
I encounter it a lot, both on environment and on homelessness, where people that are they're radical leftists, they have a radical left-wing view, but they then go and position themselves with an identity as an advocate for the homeless or a climate change activist,
Right.
or a civil rights activist or something that then they use as a way to get legitimacy among the mainstream society, even while advancing goals that are totally
Yes.
anathema to really aimed at undermining the pillars of civilization.
That is, and you saw it. I first saw it with the AIDS response in the '80s. It was a virus. It was an illness that was killing people in
Yeah.
great numbers, including one of my relatives. But the response to it was entirely political, and it was manned by people who had no special knowledge of virology or medicine.
Right.
And it was like completely taken over by political activists. I remember thinking, what is that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we see on the environment or on climate change, to give one example,
Yes.
we know the two fuels that reduce carbon emissions the most are natural gas and nuclear power. Well, those are the two fuels that climate activists are most against trying to stop. You see the
So
same
interesting.
You see the same thing on addiction. You know that addiction requires, and I have 3 friends from high school that became homeless addicts, 2 are dead. And you know that people that are suffering from addiction, you need an intervention. It's a classic way to deal with a loved one who
Yes.
is suffering from the psychiatric disorder of addiction. Well, there's a movement that is aimed at not allowing the interventions to occur. That's basically what's occurred in San Francisco, is that you have people whose addiction lead them to be homeless and living on the street. And the so-called activists, so-called advocates for the homeless, are actively preventing people from getting the medical intervention they need in order to survive and overcome their addiction.
It's absolutely remarkable. Everything is irony. It's or the opposite of what
Yeah.
it appears to
They're
be.
actually making the problems that they are claiming to address worse in each of these
Yes.
cases.
Yes.
And so, Jordan Peterson often asks, if you don't know the motivation of somebody, then look at the consequences of their actions. Well, so the consequences of homeless advocates is to increase homelessness.
Yes.
The consequence of climate activists has actually been to increase the burning of coal and wood. That's what's going on. We're going to have the biggest year for coal burning
I know.
ever this year.
I
And
know.
in Europe now, they're destroying their forests to burn wood.
Cutting ancient beech forests.
That's right.
And as a tree lover, it's so distressing just on that level.
Yes.
To me. But let me ask what the moment was, or the series of moments were, that you begin to realize this.
Well, I mean, the first was that I was never, the dominant thinking behind modern environmentalism stems from this economist, Thomas Malthus. And the idea was that
Yes.
people were always going to have too many children and that you would never have enough food. He was, of course, totally wrong. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gone from having 1 billion people on Earth to 8 billion today. We always produce more and more food. We have these huge food surpluses, at least until this year when we've had a fertilizer crisis because of the energy crisis. But nonetheless, Malthus was always wrong, but yet he has inspired environmentalists. I never bought into Malthus, mostly because I was on the radical left, and Malthus was viewed as a reactionary. So I was never bought that part of the environmental
I'm
movement.
sorry, I have to ask you to pause. In what sense was Malthus viewed as a reactionary?
Well, he was considered a conservative in that he was reacting against these Enlightenment liberals who had this very optimistic view that technological change and greater scientific awareness would allow for a large human population and basically the end of illness and maybe even the end of death. That was the ideas of Godwin and these other Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century.
So he was a forbidden thinker, so you couldn't buy into that.
Well, Malthus, yeah, I mean, for me, Malthus, it always struck me as just vaguely racist because they were always talking, the environmentalists were always talking about too many people, and they always meant Africans and Asians and Latin Americans. They weren't talking about Europeans or Americans. And so I was always turned off by Malthus. But then it was really a matter of seeing what was going on in places like Venezuela, seeing what had happened in Nicaragua, and even much of the corruption under the left-wing government of Brazil, where I started to realize that there was a problem with socialism and trying to control the entire economy by the government. And so that was part of it. And then on the environment, the big thing was we were trying to get renewables. I helped to persuade the Obama team to embrace renewables. And everywhere we looked, renewables were having a devastating impact on natural environments.
Yes.
They were destroying the deserts of California, killing our rare endangered desert tortoise. They were trying to put wind turbines up in Cape Cod. And as soon as you get close to these machines, particularly wind turbines, you just see how ecologically destructive they are, and you start to kind of go, why are we against nuclear, which has this tiny land footprint, tiny environmental impact, produces reliable pollution-free power? Suddenly it made no sense when you started to compare nuclear to renewables.
Well, and when you see it, and I mean, speaking for myself, if you actually love nature, which means the physical environment, God's inheritance, it's so unbelievable, the destruction, the desecration of the natural environment by these renewables, that you just can't even, it's bewildering to think this is actually happening in the name of the environment.
That's right.
But I don't, so clearly we know from that the people pushing it don't really care about the natural world.
Right.
Obviously. They don't know anything about it. They never go there.
Right.
But I don't understand, like, what is the motive, do you think? Like, why would they be against? Nuclear has risks, of course. It sounds scary. I get it. There's a downside to everything. There's a downside to nuclear. But compared to what? Like, what is their motive for opposing that?
I mean, for the majority of renewable energy advocates, they just don't know anything. They're disconnected from nature. But the original advocates of renewables, the goal was deindustrialization. It was to get away from modern industrial society. So we now know, there's been really good studies of this. The Industrial Revolution was not possible with wood or water wheels.
No.
Or windmills. You needed coal and fossil fuels.
It was an energy revolution.
That's exactly right. And everybody understood that. So really, starting in the 60s and 70s, the people that said they hated Western civilization, who said that industrial civilization was bad, they said we have to go back and rely on renewables and return to this agrarian economy. Well, of course, the problem is that economy couldn't support 8 billion people. It could barely support 1 or 2 billion people. So you'd be talking about like mass death and suffering to get there.
Right.
So when I say, I mean, my books, and I've done 2, and my third will be on this too, I'm really interested in defending the pillars of civilization. And the pillars of civilization, as I see it, are cheap, abundant energy, law and order, and meritocracy. And when I look at my first book, Apocalypse Never, addresses the attack on abundant, cheap energy. San Francisco describes the attack on law and order and meritocracy. You start attacking those pillars of civilization, and you just don't have a civilization left anymore.
Can you repeat those? Cheap and abundant energy.
Law and order. And meritocracy. And all 3 are under attack in a really systematic way. And so my concern is, and this is why I find myself as somebody that's traditionally been on the left and is now considered, I'm an independent, but what I see what conservatives are doing, and the role of conservatives that I think is important, is that they have this role of defending civilization. So I think the role of the left has always been to demand change and push for change, and in some cases I support that. But right now you see that the left has gone so far, and really you've even seen, I think, more moderate liberals have been radicalized, that they're now undermining the basis of our civilization.
But why would you... the alternative to civilization, and I've seen glimpses of it a couple of times, is so horrifying because it's the total domination of the weak by the strong. That's basically what a world without civilization is.
Yeah,
Any 15-year-old with an automatic rifle can rape you, can do whatever he wants. He's God. And you have no power. So, like, we spend millennia trying to build an alternative to that. We now have it. Why would you ever want to revert to the 15-year-old with the automatic weapon being in charge?
That's maybe the most important question, I think, of our time. And it's not an academic question. It's also a very practical question.
Oh, it exists. There are parts of the world where there's no civilization. I have personally seen them, so I know.
That's right.
And it's not, you can just buy a plane ticket and go there if you're interested.
Yep.
Why would anybody want that?
Yeah, well, that is a huge question. And so, I mean, I think one question is, do the people that are undermining civilization really want that? Do they know what they want? To some extent, I think they do. Where all of my work has led me, and this is where my third book is going, is that what we're dealing with is what has been known, and it's a bit of jargon, but I can't figure out how else to say it. It's really a crisis of nihilism, meaning that as people stop believing in traditional religion, as people stop believing in God, they start to adopt, and nihilism has sort of 2 meanings that are related. The first is that life has no purpose or value. We're just like animals. We're born, we reproduce, we die. There's no point to any of it. And so it doesn't really matter what you do. You're not going to be judged at the end of your life to determine where you go, heaven or hell. So that's the first nihilism. But then what it turns into is just will to power. It just turns into a desire to feel powerful, which itself is just a kind of hedonism when you get down to it. And so I think what you see, and I've also been describing the narcissism of it, which is, we see climate activists, for example, gluing their hands onto beautiful Botticelli paintings, or lighting their arm on fire in the middle of a Roger Federer tennis match to draw attention to themselves. These are lost souls in search of meaning and purpose, but they don't know what that is other than to just try to tear things down. And I think that's why we're seeing these attacks on civilization. And it's not just from the radical activists. We see it among elite media, basically saying, unless we go back to pre-industrial energy sources, we're going to end up in a climate apocalypse. They've constructed a new apocalyptic religion out of nihilism. And I think that is what's driving this crisis of civilization, is this crisis of nihilism that arguably began, a couple hundred years ago.
I agree with everything you just said. I wonder, though, if there isn't also, in addition to that, and certainly related to it, the will to self-destruction. People are the only animal that kill themselves.
Yes.
My dogs would never consider it. And Freud wrote a lot about this.
Yeah.
I wonder if there is a point in a civilization where it self-destructs on purpose. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think, well, so at the individual level, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things the most important philosopher of this is a German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, and he's famous for saying that basically as people stop believing in God, you're going to end up with this crisis of nihilism.
Right.
And he points out that people don't necessarily have a will to live, they have a will to power. And so if their way to feel powerful is to hurt themselves or to punish themselves.
Right.
And it's so powerful to read that stuff now. I reread all of it over the summer. And so, but it's also
Nietzsche this summer?
I reread it. Yeah, I've been
not a
reading
beach
it for
read,
years.
but he's an amazingly.
I read it in Martha's Vineyard, actually.
Did you? He's actually a wonderful writer. I mean, there's a reason Nietzsche has endured, because he's actually very. I don't read German, but in the English translation, it's like still vibrant.
Yeah, that's right. And so there's also a way. He also talks about how, in order to feel powerful, you manipulate your emotions first, and then you manipulate other people's emotions. So first, I make myself afraid of climate change. And then I go try to make everybody else afraid, and I gain some power over you with fear. Or I make myself feel angry, at how terrible the world is. And then I go try to make everybody else feel angry. And so you're really that manipulation of emotion that you see progressives using, whether it's on climate change or homelessness or any issue, is, I think, part of that will to power, that will to domination. And I think when you understand that for what it is, are those folks thinking about, well, we could end up turning, end up becoming like Somalia or some war zone or some anarchic war zone? Not exactly. They're just trying to get some hedonistic pleasure from their power trip and their guilt trip in the moment.
Boy, I can't imagine a more destructive program.
And it requires something. I think what it means for those of us that don't want to go down that road is it requires that we have a really positive alternative to it.
Yes.
One that I think it starts with a love of human nature, a love of human beings.
Yes.
And that means that you then have to love human civilization, because it protects humans, not just the strong, but it protects all humans. And then you get to other consequences: abundant and cheap energy, just law, law and order that's just and right, and equal justice under the law, and meritocracy. A system that helps us to get the best out of people into their best professions. We want, we don't want people that are building our bridges to be selected for some genetic characteristic. We want them selected for who's best at building bridges. So I think we got to reaffirm civilization. And for me, there's a lot of debate about political identity. A lot of people always want to know what my political identity is. And I kind of just have reverted back to, I'm pro-civilization. We need to reaffirm the pillars of civilization now more than ever.
Because you're pro-human. One of the hallmarks of an anti-human attitude, I would say, is exceedingly harsh judgment of other people's misdeeds or misstatements. And if you love people, you love them in their wholeness, and you understand that people are just tremendously fucked up by nature, like they can't kind of help it. And the people you love are going to do things that are sort of appalling. Yeah. But you love them no less, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, speaking of Nietzsche, beware those in whom the will to punish is strong.
Exactly. That's right.
We're not single people. We have different sides of ourselves.
Of course.
The line between good and evil runs through all men. So if you kind of go, let's speak to the parts of ourselves that are more transcendent, that are aiming at the common good, rather than the more base parts of ourselves.
I've never understood how people who have children, and almost all parents love their children. Bad people, Stalin loved his daughter. You know what I mean? They just can't help it. I've never understood how people who've raised children can be as harshly judgmental of other people as they are. Like, what people are like. You had them. You changed their diapers. Like, how can you really be shocked that someone said something dumb on Twitter 10 years ago?
And for me, this was why I did come back to my Christian faith, because I do think Christianity does offer a really beautiful story about that, about seeing everybody as God's children,
yes,
about the paramount importance of love, including the most radical idea that I've ever encountered in any philosophy, certainly more radical than anything I've encountered in Nietzsche, which is that one should love thy enemies. I'm not there yet. It's extremely hard to do.
I know.
I'm not good enough yet. But if you can love your enemies, then you're really transcended, I think, our more base motives. And I think that's the key to kind of putting our civilization back on a proper foundation.
Well, is there another religion in which a central tenet is bragging about how screwed up you are?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, Amazing Grace? I mean,
Yes.
It opens up with, like, I suck.
Yeah.
And that's okay, and I can admit that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. If you take that away, then the forgiveness, which is the heart of Christianity, it's like the whole point of the crucifixion, then, I don't know, I guess you wind up where we are now.
That's right. So one question is, of course, because, we have people of many different religions in our society, including people that don't have a religion. So for me, then, that's my personal orientation.
Right.
But I think the right place to start, then, for a society is at the level of the nation state and at the level of the citizen. And that's where we organize ourselves well. We organize ourselves as citizens, equal rights under the law. I then also think it then broadens out to believing that there's something special about Western civilization rather than the kind of totalitarianism that we see in places like China and Russia. And so that you see how it sort of flows out. So it's loving humans, loving civilization, believing in the special importance of one's own nation state, of Western civilization. And for me, then there's particular policy and political consequences to that. We should be producing abundant oil and gas for ourselves and for our allies in Europe and Asia who are suffering deindustrialization because of the worst energy crisis in 50 years. We should be intervening with our brothers and sisters on the streets who are suffering from severe mental illness and drug addiction. We need to have an intervention and get them the help they need. There's a set of consequences, I think, that flow from that pro-human, pro-civilization view that I don't think are obviously or easily categorizable as liberal or conservative, left or right.
No, but I mean, what a summation. What a beautiful summation.
Well, thank you, Tucker.
Of, I've got a million questions for you, but I just have to ask. So you said you spent the summer reading Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Do you read a lot of books?
I read. I mean, that's
you
all.
Still read. So are you over 40?
I'm 51. Thank you. You're very sweet.
Well, bless you. I'm roughly in your age range.
Yeah.
Why do you still read? You don't need no one reads. I mean, you have Twitter, right? But why do you think it's important? Can you just make like a 30-second case for reading books?
Oh gosh.
You seem to take it for granted.
It's like saying, it was like, why do you eat? Yeah, I mean, what I could say is one of the reasons, I mean, I do tweet and I love Twitter and I like doing television and I love, but I write books in part because there's only a book can you really take the time and get the research. My books rely on other books, and one of the things I've discovered in my books, because each of my books are very heavily referenced, each of them has over 1,000 endnotes, 1,000 references. I read great books that I think are really great books, and I check their references, and often the stuff is wrong. So I like to write a book because you have the year or two to really go through the evidence and sort through things. So for example, on drugs, should all drugs be illegal? Should some be legal? Which ones? If so, how should they be regulated? Obviously, the society has decided to legalize tobacco and alcohol. There's debates about marijuana. These things just take time that you can't get on Twitter. You need to really spend hours or days trying to get to the bottom of these things. It took me a long time to understand victim ideology, that what was going on, for example, in San Francisco and in California, was that we were leaving people on the streets because we've turned people that we've decided are victims into sacred objects. We've sort of spiritualized people that are suffering.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Objects, not human beings.
Correct.
Totems.
New victim gods. And we've done the same thing with nature, turned it into a victim god that on the one hand is to be protected from the consequences of their own actions, of their own behaviors, and on the other hand, worshipped. It's a messed up ideology, but it took me a while to get to figure out what was going on for people because it didn't make any sense. And so I guess it's a long way of saying, I think books, the reason to read them maybe is the same reason to write them, which is that only in a book do you have the time and space to really understand the full complexity of big problems, whether it's climate change or homelessness or the challenges to civilization.
What does your family think of this?
My family is very supportive. It's very progressive family. There's been some of the stuff has been challenging. Particularly, my family really did not like President Trump, as you might imagine.
Sure.
There's a lot of concerns in my family that President Trump threatens the republic. Mm-hmm. We've had to have a lot of conversations about that, partly because I lived in Latin America and I know what a threat to a republic looks like. It's junior military officers killing the senior military officers.
Yes, it is.
Burning the Constitution, taking over the Supreme Court, taking over the Parliament. It doesn't look like a failure of security at the Capitol and a guy in a Viking helmet, no, chanting and singing or whatever it was they were doing. That's not what a coup looks like. So for me, I don't express for them enough fear around the state of the republic. I think also, my positions have evolved on these issues. I think my family has come some of the way on some of it. I think they reflect where Democrats have gone on some of these issues. We've been able to change a lot of minds among Democrats on nuclear power. That does give me some hope that progressives will change their mind on these issues. Homelessness, it's been a year since San Francisco came out. We have a new district attorney who calls herself a progressive in San Francisco, but she said that she will prosecute drug dealers whose products, namely fentanyl, kill people. So I think we have seen some improvement there. So I think my family reflects the ways in which progressives and Democrats have been willing to change on some of the things that I'm concerned about.
So it hasn't destroyed your relationships?
Not yet, and I hope never.
Amen. No.
We're really trying to protect them.
Good.
Yeah.
And they are too.
They are too.
Well, they sound like good people.
That's
what matters in the end for your
I would rather we will stop talking about politics if it threatens the relationships, because those come first.
I love that. So climate change. You've written a lot about it. We've talked a lot about it, but can we just talk big picture?
Sure.
Quick, because I think you've looked deeply into it.
Yeah.
And anyone who's made it this far in the interview can see you're a legitimately serious person who's trying to find.
Thank you.
Well, you're obviously a serious person. What's the truth about not the response to climate change, what we should do about it, but the climate changing? How do you assess the truth of that?
Yeah, I believe the climate is changing. I think that humans are the main factor of that. The reason is I think we do have good temperature measurements both on land and in the oceans showing an increase in temperature. We have a good sense that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are heat trapping. Yes. So I find that all very persuasive. I also think many of the broad effects are occurring. Rising sea levels. I think we're seeing greater temperature extremes, greater precipitation, more heat waves. What I object to is first the apocalyptic presentation of it. There is no scenario that has any scientific basis for climate change threatening human life or life on Earth. Every scenario is that humans are going to actually continue to thrive and do really well this century and next century, even with a pretty significant amount of temperature increases. What really matters is...
Let me ask you a question.
No, go ahead.
So, and what would those temperature increases look like? What is likely if the status quo remains in place?
Yeah, when I first started working on this issue 20 years ago, we were worried about 4 degrees centigrade increase from pre-industrial temperatures. Now, because we have a lot of abundant natural gas, which produces half the carbon emissions as coal, looks more like it'll be 2.5 or 3 degrees. It could be less if you built a lot of nuclear power plants and natural gas plants. It would be less if you had fewer climate activists trying to stop those things. So it's not the end of the world. It's all else being equal. Most of us would like to keep the temperature band within which human civilization has been created at the same levels. That's not always going to be possible because we've built cities and farming and natural areas around a particular temperature band. So if we can keep that temperature band as much in place as possible, we should. All else, of course, is not equal, and it was fossil fuels that allows for human civilization and the peace and the prosperity and security and freedom that it allows. So you're always having to judge that against it. But that's why sort of my view is I don't get super precise around what the right temperatures ought to be. It's more like the direction of travel should be away from wood and towards coal, oil, natural gas, uranium. If you're using coal, move to natural gas. If you can, move to nuclear because it's the king of all energy sources. That's the right direction of travel. There's a lot of false precision in this space where people think they can get, you've often seen they predicted there wouldn't be any coral on the Great Barrier Reef or the glaciers were all going to disappear. That turned out not to be right. We still have glaciers, more coral than in the last 35 years on the Great Barrier Reef. So, but generally speaking, we should just want to have less temperature change.
Well, that mindset that produces those predictions is itself, I think, a huge part of the problem.
Yeah.
Which is that we fully understand all natural systems.
Yeah.
Or that our mechanistic way of thinking can ever ultimately explain things that are inherently mysterious or operate outside the bounds of known physics. I mean, there are a lot of things that we can't actually quantify. We don't really understand.
Most things.
Most things. Did you read Matthias Desmet's book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism?
I have not read that.
It has just come out, and it's purportedly about COVID, and it's sort of about COVID. It's not really about COVID. It's very worth reading.
I will read it.
Most interesting book I've read this year, by far.
Okay, for sure.
But anyway, and he makes that point that the scientific method as we understand it is actually limited in its ability to fully understand the things that most need to be understood. And if you don't start there with that acknowledgement of reality, then you're going to wind up in this like crazed hubristic place where you're like telling me, how hot it's going to be on Wednesday 300 years from now. Like you're an idiot.
Absurd.
It's absurd.
Yeah, so humility is really important.
Thank you. Sorry, that's the other way to put it, right?
Yeah. I mean, just look at what we're doing and what you've been. I love your reporting on anomalous phenomena.
Yes.
We used to call them UFOs, but we don't even know if they're objects.
Don't know anything.
And even there, you start to see people jumping to some conclusions rather than sitting in the mystery a little bit. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we have these stories about how the universe began and where we came from, and I think some of them, like I mentioned, I have a particular faith, and I think there's positive consequences to some faiths, whereas others don't have as positive consequences. But I think it's important to have some humility around the essential mystery of.
Well, sure.
universe.
I mean, I like religious people of all kinds. The only variety, and I like people just as a default position. I just kind of like people. But the one group I don't like and have never liked are people who think they're God.
Yes.
So I don't care as much about who you think God is unless you think it's you, in which case I'm not on your side.
And it's interesting because often those people, like, for example, the folks that are in the grip of apocalyptic environmentalism, they don't think that they're religious. They think that they're just describing, they think that you're...
As they block traffic on the 405.
Exactly. Yeah, and talk about a fall from nature and about the end of the world. And so they're the most dangerous in some senses.
Oh, I
because
couldn't agree more.
If you say I'm Hindu or Jewish or Christian, you have some awareness that you have of faith.
Totally. No, that's exactly right. Completely agree with you. Why is this such a sidetrack? And I promise I'll get us back to energy, but how did so many smart people wind up swallowing the lie that all suffering in human history is the product of organized religion? It's just not actually true, just like it's checkably untrue.
Right.
But how did they sell that?
Well, it's so interesting, right? Because, of course, you have to ask, why would you make that argument? And it seems like you're making that argument if you're trying to introduce a new religion.
Right.
I mean, I think that wokeism it's not the greatest word ever, but I do think wokeism does describe a kind of unity of this new religion.
Totally.
It's a kind of all the stuff around race and gender and climate. It's constructing a new religion to fit under the old one. And so it would look at existing religions as a rival to its new hegemony.
So what a smart answer. That's totally right. And I just speaking for myself as someone who comments on the news every day, I lost 6 months of just confusion by not noting the obvious right away, right after George Floyd died, that this is a religion. See people washing each other's feet in the street, and you're like, oh, that's not a political movement, that's a religion. Duh.
Oh, the kneeling. I mean, in Martha's Vineyard, they had a sign up at one of the churches, which was like every Thursday, a kneeling. And that's clearly a religious effort. It doesn't have much to do with protecting African Americans from the police or reducing crime. So, yeah, I think that it's helpful to think of it that way because I think it makes me feel like it helps to. It's a good reminder that you're limited in how much you can influence people's thinking when they're fully in the grip of a kind of fanaticism.
Yeah, not really at all.
No.
Actually. So how, another far field question, but I can't control myself. nuclear power, if you were to strip away the legal costs, take all the lawyers out of it,
Yeah.
all the liability. I mean, I'm not saying you should, but let's say you did and took out the regulatory stuff. How cheap is it?
The cheapest. Of
It
course
is.
it is. Of course it is. Yeah, and probably it's twice as expensive as it should be in the United States. Now in countries like Korea, where they were so poor they had to have nuclear to make electricity cheap, one of the things that they couldn't get too fancy, and so they had the same construction crews building the same kind of reactors over and over again. All they did was increase the size, which produced more electricity at a lower cost. They were able to bring nuclear plant construction time down lower than coal plants. So nuclear can be cheaper than coal. There's actually far less, this amount of uranium can provide me with all the power I need for my high energy life. Then, of course, it comes out the other end as so-called waste byproduct stored at the site of production. So you can see in that picture of it, small number of workers, tiny amount of fuel goes through the plant. There's really hardly any waste disposal. They just put it you can just put it above ground. There's no need to bury it on like a basketball court, chain link fence it, it's fine. So the cost should be, and you can see why that would be so threatening to all of the other sources of energy. A lot of these guys coming in, the solar guys, the wind guys, they're looking to fleece consumers. They're looking to rip off and raise electricity prices.
Anyone who lives in a rural area, as I do, can tell you that's exactly what's happening. So I cover politics, not energy, but so I'm very aware of the politics of control, which really, that is what politics is. Really, it's a means of control. So, and governance, but control.
Yes.
So clearly, energy policy is about a lot of things, religion, as we said, but it's about control also.
Absolutely.
And so, since no one trusts anyone anymore in the United States, you can't have gone through 2 years of COVID and trust the authorities anymore. Clearly, they're not worth trusting. Why don't we move towards some radically decentralized grid where I have a nuclear reactor in my house? I mean, if you can power a submarine or an aircraft carrier, why can't I power my house?
Yeah, well, let me say one thing also about the control, because the fantasy, the vision, the official vision, is that you're going to have a super grid. It was always even supposed to be global super grid, where they would not only control where you got your electricity from, namely from solar panels and wind turbines, but also control when you're able to use your washing machine, it's called demand response. Well, they announced a phase out of internal combustion engines in California on August 25th. On August 29th, they said, please don't plug in your electric vehicles because we're having power outages. So the danger of becoming all electric is that we become even more vulnerable to these kinds of outages. In terms of centralization, the thing to keep in mind is that as power plants got bigger, they produced cheaper electricity for more people. And so there was a factor of the centralization of energy production.
Sure.
Economies of scale allows for greater decentralization. Nuclear has always had a dual use. First use was as a weapon, and so there's always been heavy government involvement to making sure that these fuels aren't diverted in some way.
Was its first uses? I mean, I guess I knew that. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the first use of nuclear power.
Yeah, and then the Navy, the DOE messed around for a long time. They actually weren't the big pioneers of nuclear energy. It was the Navy that then created submarines and aircraft carriers. And the Admiral Hyman Rickover, then went and created the first nuclear power plant in the late 1950s. And in fact, in that process, created the entire nuclear energy industry, really against a very unenthusiastic electric utilities who are pretty stuck in their ways. They were stuck with what they had. So we have this beautiful industry that got created by Eisenhower really in the 50s.
How did I make it to 53 not knowing that? So the Navy created nuclear power?
Yeah,
as an outgrowth of its power generation for submarines and ships?
That's right. And there's a bit of a mythology about this, that somehow there was a mistake made in the kind of technology, but the technology that they created actually was the best of what they could at the time and still has worked out really well. It just uses water as the main coolant.
Right.
We have abundant water on Earth. It's not a complicated technology. There's a lot of ideas that there should have been some radically different technology, but the fact of the matter is it's like jet turbines. The same jet turbines that we had in 1945 we have today. We've just made them better and we operate them better. And that's basically the same with nuclear power.
That's fascinating. So because nuclear energy itself, plutonium or uranium, have a dual use, and they are inherently dangerous if not contained properly, we're not going to see
your own backyard nuclear plant.
Yeah.
Not for a while. I mean, it's there's ideas of creating really small nuclear generators that would be able to compete with diesel generators. I'm not quite sure how it would work from a security perspective.
Right. No, that's obviously, clearly haven't thought this through, but I do think at some point people are going to want to have more independence than they have. I mean, if the trend is toward the worst people on earth controlling your energy, there's got to be some counter movement against that, right?
Understandably, that there would be. I just think that, part of if you get to the pillars of civilization and you need cheap and reliable electricity, we know the best way to deliver that is with pretty big centralized power plants.
No, that's right.
And a distributed grid. And I think this is why we have to fight for civilization, so that we don't let the grifters control.
No,
where
you're
we get our
right.
energy
You're absolutely
from.
right. So my instinct is always to run to the woods, but that's not civilization, actually.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think these things start to question what is liberal, what's conservative. I mean, I definitely, there's certain times where I'm like, I'm done with all the, the craziness, and you just want to check out from it. But I think we have to fight for these institutions because they are being taken over, and it really does pose a danger to our civilization. More in Europe, as we've seen with this energy crisis, than in the United States. But we're going to see, skyrocketing energy prices here as well as a consequence of this war on civilization.
I wonder, since we do have, this is, a confederacy of 50 states, I wonder if you'll see states opt out from this. Will that happen?
You mean from renewables?
Yeah, exactly right. From energy trends that cause energy to become scarcer and more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're going to opt out of renewables because they're basically all of the component parts are made in China, and it would be insane to substitute this beautiful security, hard-won, bipartisan from the 1970s until today to produce so much of our oil and gas domestically, to trade that for dependence on China for these rare earths and other minerals that are involved in creating solar panels and wind turbines, not to mention the fact that the solar panels we now know are being made by incarcerated Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps in China.
The whole thing is like so dystopian.
When I testified in front of Congress a couple of weeks ago, I raised this point multiple times. For me, it's a categorical moral imperative. You can't buy solar panels from people that were in concentration camps. I mean, it seems like, why is that so hard to understand? Biden said
we're
he was
only going to
ban
light
them.
with human skin lampshades. I mean, it's like so dark.
It's
like,
really dark.
Oh my God.
And it was the only time I saw AOC shift uncomfortably in her seat was when I really went after that. I said, if we care about Muslim rights, progressives have made a lot about Muslim rights. Uyghur Muslims are the most persecuted Muslims in the world. I know there's competition with Iran, but they're in concentration camps in China. How is this even a thing that we're still importing those solar panels?
What did she say?
She didn't say anything. The Democrats, they know they have a problem on this. They've said that. They know they have a supply chain problem. There's an idea that we're going to return these big factories from China. Look, we'll be lucky if we can do it with microchips, and that's a national security priority.
Yes.
Solar panels are way down the list. It's not a strategic industry. It's a niche technology. It's great for your backyard. I've got solar panels in my backyard. But it is a strategic priority that we dominate on nuclear energy. It's a strategic priority that we dominate on microchips, personal protective gear. But solar panels, hopefully it'll happen one day that we repatriate those industries. But until then, we can't be buying any more solar from China.
What about, you can see I'm fixated on this question, but
it's
I don't like
shocking.
control. It is. Renewables, wind, and particularly solar, at this point in their development as technologies, how realistic is it to think you could kind of run your house independently from the grid?
Not at all. In fact, what you find in California is that you need the grid. If you have solar panels, you need the grid when there's a blackout. When there's a blackout, those solar panels, because they're so interconnected, they are not self-sufficient. And so what people do, if you want to be fully independent, or at least have some backup, you just need a backup diesel generator.
Right.
But when we had a blackout and my neighbors ran a diesel generator, it was really smoky and not very pleasant to have a diesel generator running next to your house.
For sure. But if you had, as battery technology advanced to the point where you could store meaningful amounts of electricity and you just run your entire life on solar panels on your roof?
There is an amount of batteries you would need. It would be prohibitively expensive for the vast majority of people.
You can't go independent with renewables.
No, even I went to a billionaire's house once where he had made it all self-sufficient, and it cost him millions of dollars. You could do it probably for several $100,000 with lithium batteries, but at that point, it's the cost of a house.
Yeah.
And of course, the wind and the sun still need to shine. I mean, we always point out that there's periods where there's no sun and no wind. Often weeks go by. So just to give you a sense of it, one calculation, it takes $750 billion of lithium batteries to back up the electrical grid for 4 hours. You need weeks of backup. So lithium batteries is just not a way to deal with that.
Is battery technology approaching some breakthrough point, do you think? I mean, it's hard to chart this out, but does it feel like we're on the cusp of some radical revolution in energy storage technology, or that no?
No, not at all. And in fact, the other problem with the lithium batteries, they're also made in Xinjiang province by those same Uyghur Muslims. That's the New York Times reporting this. Is not a conspiracy theory. So, but it's more like the issue is that solar panels and wind turbines and lithium batteries all became much cheaper. But the more of them that are used on the grid, the more expensive it makes electricity. And that's because of the high cost of managing all that unreliable energy. Just more people, more backup machinery, more effort. California has to pay Arizona to take our excess solar electricity for some of the year. But then when we are in a really hot summer, as we were, then we don't have enough electricity to import. So it's just, what you really want with electricity is just a pretty even match of supply and demand. That's why it's so cheap.
And it's hard on the equipment, right?
Very hard. Absolutely. And including people talk about fast charging the electric cars. That way you get a refill just as fast with gasoline. That has a huge impact on batteries. It wears them out much faster. So there's just really, the fundamentals of electricity haven't changed from Thomas Edison. You want big power plants, centralized. You want to match supply and demand as much as you can. You want to minimize the amount of energy penalties of converting energy from electricity to chemicals or to some other storage and then bringing them back on the grid, because all of those things increase the cost.
Now we're going way down the rabbit hole, but someone once suggested to me that a simple way to store energy would be if you had solar panels rather than rely on batteries, is just build a tower with an extremely heavy weight, lift it, and then as it goes down, it generates power. Why? Basically the same principle as hydropower.
Yes.
Right? You have a lake, you open it up, gravity pulls the water through, spins the turbines, electricity. Why wouldn't that work?
The reason is because the water is able to create power density. You're able to create a huge amount of energy by concentrating that water and running over a turbine that you're not able to do with those cranes, with those devices with the cranes lifting the blocks up and down. They've tried it. And so it was an interesting physics question, but they did try it, and it doesn't work out physically or economically in the way that water does turn out to still be, we call it pumped storage.
Yes,
turns out to be the best way to store electricity, and should continue to be used. But yeah, the blocks or just wrapping the band around a wheel, those all seemed like good ideas, but they've never worked out at a physical or economics level.
How interesting. So how did you wind up running for governor of California?
Well, I mean, I tried to support the former mayor.
Do you have a spouse?
Am I married?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, she was not crazy about the idea.
That was the implied question, yes.
Yeah, I mean, we wrote San Francisco. It did change things, but it was clear that nobody was going to challenge the governor on that platform. I was planning on supporting the mayor of San Diego, who I thought was going to run. It became clear he wasn't going to do that. The clock was ticking. I work with parents of kids who have either died from fentanyl or are homeless addicts. The moms asked if I would run. My wife, Helen, said, okay, what am I going to do? Say no. But we did. We had a great time. I mean, it was a 3-month-long campaign. We didn't have enough time. We ran out of time. But I think by the end of it, Helen, I think she understood why it was important. She had a chance to meet these moms and meet these kids. I mean, it's a life or death situation for people on the streets. They're not able to arrest their children, provide their children with the intervention they know they need. And these, after a time, you meet these guys that have been on the street for a long time, and they have a hunchback. They're suffering from long-term physical ailments associated with long-term opioid use. It's really a tragedy, and it's totally preventable. We know we can do what they've done in Europe. We can do what they do in Japan and Korea, everywhere else in the world, make the intervention, give people the help they need. So that, for me, was the main reason. I just think that our treatment of our fellow humans on the streets is barbaric. It's not fair to them, and of course, it's not fair for the residents either,
agree.
who have to deal with all the
I
consequences.
absolutely agree. It's just interesting to me. I said this at the outset, but you've zeroed in on what I think, just from watching, are the two most important issues: energy and drugs. I grew up in California. I'll admit it, I was never especially against drugs. I grew up in a different country. Drugs didn't seem like a huge threat.
Right.
And the way they were characterized struck me as hysterical. Just
Yeah.
say no.
Right.
And I thought it was a joke.
Right.
And I was around a lot of drugs, and now, and it's not just because I'm older, it's because the country's changed. I see drugs as like truly destroying the country. And not just in the homeless populations, but among people I know who've been prescribed this garbage by their doctors. It's like destroying them.
Tucker, it was 17,000 drug-induced deaths, overdoses and poisonings in the year 2000. This year, it's going to be over 107,000
Well,
deaths.
exactly.
That's 3 times more deaths than from car accidents. It's the #1 cause of death for people 18 to 45.
But they even, of course, I brood on those statistics and often repeat them, but I think they're an undercount in the sense that opioids particularly steal your soul.
Yeah.
They make you less than human.
Yeah.
They make you narcissistic. They make you fearful.
Yep.
They take away your dignity. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that people live like that every day is an ongoing tragedy. I'd
you've
rather
got-
be dead.
Yeah, if you know the experience of a parent with a child who's an addict, it's heartbreaking because you can either maintain and enable your child's addiction by letting them stay in the house and lie, steal, and cheat from you to maintain their addiction, or you can kick them out knowing full well that they're going to likely turn to theft or sex work in order to maintain their habit and live on the street where very bad things happen. So it's a tragedy within those families that doesn't need to happen. When those things break down, the society needs to step in. We don't let people sleep on the street. We should not let people sleep on the street.
Exactly.
We should not let people use drugs in public. If those things are happening, that's a cry for help. And the society needs to respond by arresting that person and mandating that they get the help that they need. That's what they do in every civilized society in the
I
world.
could not agree more. And instead, if you have the people in charge encouraging encouraging behavior that strips away your humanity,
Yes.
what does that tell you?
Yeah, it's a manifestation of a kind of sickness, honestly. I mean, it's a kind of, in the book, I hesitate between saying it's definitely pathological altruism. Is it Munchausen syndrome by proxy? It looks like it.
Yes, it does. I never thought of that.
Is it consciously trying to make people sick? It's probably not totally fair, but it's definitely pathological. Look at the consequences.
Yeah, I've never been mad at. I've known some junkies. I've never been mad at a junkie ever. I've been mad at what they do, but I don't hate them or anything.
Yeah.
But anyone who would abet that, yeah, I mean, I feel rage toward them.
No, it's like being, when you know someone has schizophrenia and you understand that, it's like you want them to get treatment. It's not their fault that the society has failed to treat them.
Exactly.
So it's like, yeah, like we don't blame people for having cancer, but we have an obligation to get people the treatment they need if they're suffering from drug addiction or from untreated mental illness.
So I've got 2 final questions. One, do you see this? It feels like we're moving toward, we're moving toward something. If you think that history moves in directions.
For sure.
And it does, obviously. Is this getting better or worse, or what happens next?
I mean, I've been reading all the, there's books about how Western civilization is coming to an end that have been written for a couple hundred years.
Yes.
So, it's, in some ways that makes me happy because I read a book about how Western civilization is coming to an end and then you're like, well, actually it came back and it seemed to be doing pretty well.
Yeah, yeah.
So clearly there's something cyclical going on. Europe is going to fall apart and there's going to be very significant change. We're 3 months away still almost from winter and we're already seeing huge protests. We've already seen governments fall in Sweden and Italy. We see Sri Lanka, Haiti's probably next. I think we're going to see a huge turnover of the political class over the next 3 years or so. We could see very different heads of state in Europe and around the world, and that gives me hope. We need to, there needs to be a different head of the United Nations, different head of the IMF, a different head of the International Energy Agency. Yeah. The heads of those institutions are actually undermining the mission of those organizations, which is civilization, abundance, prosperity.
Every post-war institution, some of them probably aren't serving any good purpose anyway at this point.
Yeah, some could certainly go. But what gives me hope is that we're headed for a period of significant change, I think it's going to be there's going to be a lot of darkness there. There's going to be a lot of violence. There's going to be a lot of suffering. That's going to be part of the process. But I do think it's going to give a chance for something new to emerge. Something clearly, we're coming out of the post-Cold War neoliberal era. Clearly, the world's reverting back towards the nation state. I think that's healthy. We went way too far with globalization and neoliberalism. So I think that's very healthy. I'd like to see an affirmation, as I mentioned before, of the human spirit, of Western civilization, of the West. And I think we have a clear global rival in China that we should be identifying ourselves against as something we don't want to be like. People still want to live. People still want to come to America. They're not fighting to get into China. We have a lot going for us. So I think in some ways the whole system is going to revert back to, let's look to what America is doing. America still has the right recipe of liberal democracy, free markets, a strong culture, but we do need to affirm it against this kind of woke, fanatical religion.
I will say the one upside of living in this moment of real turmoil, actual turmoil, not fake turmoil, not performative turmoil, but like truly tectonic change, is that it produces like serious thinking. I've met more people in the last 2 years who I'm really impressed by, and you're one of them for sure,
Thank you.
than I have in like the preceding 25 years. So that's kind of cool. You know, crisis produces serious, rigorous analysis, whereas
For sure.
the Clinton years didn't produce much.
For sure. And it's coming from the margins too. It's notable. It's not coming from the centers.
100% from the margins. 100%. I don't even talk I'm totally happy, and I have friends who are like on the radical left who I really value and love, and I'm challenged by it. I think they're interesting. I can't talk to anybody who believes whatever the sort of hysteria of the day is. It's just too dumb. There's no time
It's not interesting.
at all. And it also suggests just a kind of laziness. Like, last question. To the extent you can tell us, what's the thesis of your next book?
Well, I had a title of it, but my publisher doesn't love it. The title was Progressive Nihilism, Why Civilized People Undermine Civilization.
Ooh.
And so that's what I'm excited about. It's definitely
the subtitle's got to stay. That's so
Thank
good.
you. It's definitely the third book in this trilogy. I wanted to write 3 books on the threats to civilization from within. And it'll definitely take a look back. It'll have certainly some chapters about the environment, some chapters about homelessness. But I'm definitely taking on some new issues, ones I'm not quite there yet ready to talk about, but you could probably predict some of them that look like symptoms of nihilism in the culture. And then I want to talk about what the purpose, how to reaffirm a pro-human, pro-civilization, pro-Western civilization agenda would look like.
What kind of response do you get? I mean, you live in California still, of course. You ran for governor.
Very polarizing. Very polarized response. Well, yeah, the nice thing is that because I'm so completely ignored by liberal media, nobody knows who I am in Berkeley, so I can still, freely go out and not be identified. But yeah, much better known on the conservative side of things these days, and that's fine. I'm happy to. Like I said, I think
your parents never get to see you.
They're not big Fox viewers.
It's okay. Michael Shellenberger. Wow, that was great.
What a pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
you having
And
me
I hope
on.
you'll come and tell us about the new book when you finish it.
I would love to. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Tucker Carlson today is the name of the show. New episodes at least 3 days a week on Fox Nation. Of course, we'll see you relentlessly again and again, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.